Welcome to Get Rich Education. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Is a housing price crash imminent? As soon as homeowners that lost their jobs in the recession are able to be foreclosed upon, will this create a flood of new supply on the market and make housing prices crater almost everywhere? Predicting a housing price crash with an expert guest today that's right on the cutting edge of what's happening in the real estate market today on Get Rich Education. You know, starting in real estate seems hard for some. Even experienced investors can find it difficult to achieve the success that they had hoped for. What if there was one small change everyone could make that would solve these challenges? Allie Boone offers a book that really no one else has. It's an easy-to-understand glimpse into the real estate investing industry and your mindset. It's life lessons on hacking your mind before you hack your wallet. Her book to grab on Amazon is called Not Your How-To Guide to Real Estate Investing. Most rental property investors choose either cash flow or home price appreciation, but one real estate market can give you both. Jacksonville, Florida, with 27% lower home prices than the national median, 1% higher gross rents, and Jacksonville has appreciated 34% more than other comparable cash flow markets over the last 30 years. Get positive cash flow today and appreciation for tomorrow. To invest for cash flow and growth in Jacksonville, go to cashflowandgrowth.com.
You're listening to the show that has created more financial freedom than nearly any show in the world. This is Get Rich Education.
Welcome to GRE, from Palm Beach, Florida to Palm Springs, California, and across 188 nations worldwide. I'm Keith Weinhold. This is Get Rich Education. You are back in that abundant weekly place. You gotta be, because the scarcity mentality is abundant and the abundance mentality is scarce. Before we talk with an expert that's the founder and CEO of one of the nation's top real estate analytics firms and really goes deep into the numbers with us, if you're in real estate, look, you do care about housing prices, even though that might not be the most important thing to you. If your values go down, well, that might not be the main thing as long as your tenant sustains your rent and your income. In fact, last week on our Get Rich Education Instagram page, we had a poll. Are you in real estate for the appreciation or for the cash flow? And any idea what percent voted for the cash flow? And you could only pick among those two, appreciation and cash flow. 92% said cash flow. Yeah. But housing prices still matter. Because if you get good appreciation, well, then you can take some of the equity out of that property and turn it into more cash flow. Yeah. Now, both today's guest and I are not new to real estate. I think that it's wise for you to follow someone that's been around the block a few times. In fact, both my guest and I, for us, this is our second steep recession where we've invested in real estate right through it. Thus far, real estate has not only held up well in this recession, but prices have surged. But what does the future hold? We are squarely going to answer that today. Let's get some context first and compare and contrast what happened in the last recession, known as the global financial crisis of 2007 to 2009, and then compare that with this current one to see what we can learn and glean from those experiences. I'm excited about today's show because the real estate world is going to learn a ton of lessons today with each of us together. I'd really like you to listen to a most interesting real estate timeline of this week's guest. After a successful tech career in Silicon Valley, he purchased and flipped over 150 residential and commercial properties, and he did this about 15 years ago. He exited the market in 2006, right before the credit bubble burst. And now, with this technology and real estate experience that he launched something called Foreclosure Radar in 2007, and that quickly helped people recognize the nation's best foreclosure properties. And then in 2013, he rebranded and launched Property Radar, expanding beyond just foreclosures and into property data, giving small businesses and investors like you the same opportunities found in public records that big businesses have long enjoyed, but he brings that to everyday people. He's based in the Lake Tahoe area. Welcome to Get Rich Education, Sean O'Toole.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Sean, let's begin back more toward the beginning. You saw something in 2005 and 6, which preceded a devastating real estate crash. And I think that everyone likes to see the future. So what gave you this premonition? What is it that you were seeing then?
There was a few things that kind of came together. One was a slowdown in sales volume. And most people attributed that at the time to a lack of inventory. But that was kind of the first canary in the coal mine, as it were. And especially with that combined with longer days on market, when you've got tighter and tighter inventory and shorter days on market where things are selling more quickly, that's a pretty good sign that the market's still strong. But when you've got very little inventory or very few sales and rising inventory and rising days on market, that's definitely a concern point. So that started happening at the end of '05 in my markets. Every market's a little different. Then there was a couple of other more subjective versus database things. One was I would go around to local new home sellers. It went from they had a waiting list for new home releases to they were offering a free swimming pool if you bought a new home. And that changed pretty quickly. And
it's quite a concession.
Quite a concession, yeah. And this was in Stockton, California, which 60 Minutes called the epicenter of the foreclosure crisis. So pretty big shift there, kind of end of '05, beginning of '06. And then the other one that was probably the most personal for me and really cemented my decision to exit the market is I was selling a house in Stockton for around $400,000. And the buyers, she was a maid and he was a field worker.
Yeah.
A lot of ag in that area. They're buying a $400,000 house. And I'm going, wait a second. And I usually never met the buyers. I always use brokers to list my stuff, even though I'm a broker myself. But I happened to meet this couple, and they're a really nice Hispanic couple, and I was chatting with them a little bit, and they were so excited to be homeowners. But I'm just like, well, wait a second, how are you affording this? And realized that they were being qualified based on the option payment of a pay option arm, which just makes no sense. And ultimately, I knew they couldn't afford the property, and that really shook me. I tried to convince them not to buy, but it's homeownership's a dream. And when the bank tells you it's okay and Greenspan is telling you it's okay and
Right.
all the politicians are telling you it's okay, right? You want to believe. I thought that was just awful. And I really didn't want to participate.
This is interesting. You were anecdotally feeling the temperature of the market back then. Being a real estate investor since 2002 myself, I remember the popular investor sentiment and just the sentiment of everyday people. You know what I heard an awful lot back around 2005 and 2006, Sean? I heard a lot of people say something I've never heard since. They sure wouldn't say this today. People were saying home prices never go down. It's a great investment. You can't lose money. I heard that an awful lot about 15 years ago. Home prices never go down, but they sure do. So you're seeing some anecdotal signs with what you just told us about. And I think it's this effect of as soon as your Uber driver has a 10-minute ride with you and they can't stop talking about getting into housing or getting into Bitcoin, you start to wonder, is this a speculative frenzy? Is this sustainable? So some of those anecdotal signs were there. You talked about the concession with the swimming pool. Tell us more about this in this subprime bust that in 2007 to 2009 made home prices take a devastating turn.
An interesting thing there, when you talked about the subprime bust, is subprime is really where it got its start. And like in that swimming pool example, they were primarily selling to folks who had not only no credit, but maybe bad credit. I started thinking to myself, well, when the guy who paid full price for a house and didn't get a swimming pool, but has bad credit, didn't put anything down, finds out the guy next door got a swimming pool, is he going to continue to make or she going to continue to make their payments? Are they going to be pissed? That worried me a bit. And I decided to get out at the end of 2005, beginning of 2006. Ben Bernanke in the middle of 2007 was saying, this is a subprime crisis and largely contained and shouldn't affect the broader markets. And this is where real estate data becomes really interesting because in 2007, in Stockton, again, the epicenter, right, as some have said, we saw median prices going up. But I knew, having been, especially in 2006, median prices were still going up across the board. And as a local investor, though, I knew that prices were going down across the board. So how does the newspaper report prices going up when they're in fact going down? This is a really important thing I don't think people realize is median prices measure two things. They measure change in price, which is what we all expect it to measure, but it also measures change in mix. And because lending stopped at the low end first, high-end home sales continued and became a larger percentage of all sales. So you just keep the math simple. Let's say half of your homes are selling for $200,000 and half of your homes are selling for $400,000, right? You end up with a $300,000 median. But when you go to 80% of your homes being 400 or 100% of your homes being $400,000, right? And 0% being 100, even though maybe, well, let's say those 400 have dropped to 350. So you get 100% selling at 350 and 0 at that lower end. Your median price still goes up, even though prices have gone down across the board. And I really think that confused the markets, confused the Fed, and all the rest, where people thought there was more strength in the market than there actually was, just because of how poor our measures of real estate are.
That is a great point. And if you, the listener, don't understand the subprime bust and what that meant, subprime is basically the mortgage company's term for those least credit-worthy borrowers that were still able to get loans, which is a big part of what led to the housing crisis about 15 years ago. We had such loose lending standards. To your point, Sean, you touched on where people didn't know which numbers to look at. So we're talking about parsing the difference between median home values and average home values in something as highly segmented as real estate. So a lot of people didn't see those signs. What numbers should one be looking at? How can one tell when the numbers aren't telling them the truth?
It's really tough there. One thing is to break it down by quartile. You do those same median home prices by quartile. I mean, the advantage of a median over an average is that, let's say you're in a home with typical home values of $600,000, but somebody sells some estate on the hill for $10 million, right? That will move the average up,
right?
But it won't move the median. So that's why we use median instead of average. So you don't get an outlier pushing prices around. It's still a problem when you have something like the lower end mortgage market goes away and the high end mortgage market continues pretty strong. You can still see this shift that we saw in 06 and 07. Breaking it down by quartiles, looking at the top 25% of homes, second 25, third, fourth is one way to kind of get a better understanding of how those individual markets are moving. But no, there aren't any great measures out there right now that are available to the average home buyer.
The difference between the median and average, median being the house price at which half the homes sell for more and half the homes sell for less, average being take 10 sale prices, add them all up and divide by 10 there. So we're talking about the difference between the average housing price and the median housing price. And we're talking about some of the differences between that recession in 2007, 2009, which led to a terrible crash and a degradation in housing values of 10%, 20%, 30%, even up to 50% or more in some overbuilt markets like Phoenix and Las Vegas. That was a crash, and a lot of it has to do with supply and demand dynamics. So we had a glut of housing supply in the global financial crisis of 12 to 15 years ago. But now we're in that opposite condition where we have this real dearth of supply. Where have all the houses gone? That's what people are asking today. So can you talk to us more about some of the differences and the key distinctions between the global financial crisis of 2007 to 2009 and its housing market versus what's happening today where we have this low supply?
It's really unfortunate. Construction never really recovered in most markets after the 2008 crisis, right? All those folks that were in construction work, or a lot of those folks, just moved to other industries and never came back and don't want to come back. So we've got a real shortage of labor. We've also had, especially recently, increases in lumber and other building materials costs and an awful lot of regulation. We certainly feel that here in California,
Yeah.
where Title 24, even the requirement to put solar on new homes just makes new home building so unaffordable that it's very difficult for a builder to come in and build a home that will meet market demands in terms of being affordable and being a quality product, while also still leaving some profit in play. Especially here in California, we have an awful lot of laws around entitling new land and the rest that just make it very difficult to develop new projects. And to some degree, you have some mix of those things happening throughout the rest of the country as well. California is certainly one of the worst. That has just led to this undersupply of housing, especially in the places where people most want to be. And that undersupply of housing, when you still have demand from growing populations, does create this distortion in the market that we're certainly feeling still.
We had those loose lending standards 15 years ago where the old joke was all you need to do is fog a mirror and you essentially get a loan. So lending standards have tightened considerably since the global financial crisis.
Let me jump in on that for just a second. If you think about housing prices in 2005, they were at a peak, right? And that's when we had this quote unquote pulse loan, or you said fog a mirror, right? If you can fog a mirror, you can get a loan. And that was an incredibly risky thing to do. 3 years later, in 2009, prices were so low that if you didn't make your payments, there was virtually no risk for the lender because they could just rent the house out for probably a better return than they got from collecting your mortgage payments. I don't necessarily believe that borrower quality is the most important thing. I think it's borrower quality and price. So if your price is at a point where that borrower can easily be replaced by a renter with no loss for the lender, there's really no risk. And in 2009, we should have been making loans to anybody who could fog a mirror. And in 2005, we shouldn't have been making loans to anybody but those that put down huge down payments and were super committed. And we do exactly the opposite. And we're doing the opposite again right now, whereas prices go up and inventory gets harder and it gets harder to qualify, we continue to loosen credit standards. And then after a crash, we tighten credit standards. So we do exactly the opposite of what we should be doing to minimize risk in markets. Now, we're not doing it as badly as we did in 2005 in terms of loosening up, but still, credit terms are loosening right now, and we should be doing the opposite.
That's a great take. And when it comes to construction, which is what it takes to get us out of this undersupplied condition, you had touched on it earlier, Sean. A lot of people left the construction industry after the global financial crisis because homes were so overbuilt, their services weren't needed, and a lot of them got trained into doing other things. Back shortly after the global financial crisis, 2009, 2010, you could buy homes for less than the replacement cost. So if you can buy an existing home for less than the replacement cost, there's very little incentive to want to do new build. And those are just a couple reasons why we have transitioned and the meter has moved away from an oversupplied condition back then to an undersupplied condition now. And it is more difficult to bring on some of that supply. We do have this spike in lumber costs and other building materials when it comes to building new. And actually, these things affect the rehabber too. A lot of people think about new construction only when they think about all these pandemically induced supply disruptions, but that, of course, affects the rehabber as well. So when we talk about supply and just how low the supply is now, there are an awful lot of ways that you can parse that. But if you look at the Federal Reserve data's active listing count, 1 year ago, there were 1 million homes available in active listing count terms anyway. That was March of 2020. And today, we've gone from that 1 million down to 600K today. This lack of supply.
Yeah. Another piece of that, back on the demand side, that's a little interesting, I think, with COVID, right, is one thing that people tend to underestimate is the ability of households to combine and disperse. And by that, what I mean is in a downturn, you will get a contraction in demand because two households will move in together and become one household, right? Could be parents and children, or even cousins, or even completely unrelated folks. And we saw that in the last downturn, where people go from having their own home to having three families share a home, with each family in a bedroom in a 3-bedroom house. And so you can get pretty radical contraction of demand typically. But I think with COVID, this desire not to be in households together, we even saw households with like a nurse or a doctor, and they're like, we need a second household just to keep our own family safe, our immediate family safe, right? We need two places to live because I don't want to come home from my job and bring something with me. We saw this really rapid expansion of demand with COVID this last year, which I really think exacerbated everything as well.
Yeah, we're talking about household formation and household contraction here. That ability for people to combine into one household or disperse into multiple households, and how that tempers the demand for housing in the United States, which eventually is going to affect the price. I think one of the more interesting ones, Sean, is some of the Pew Research data that recently showed us that currently 52% of young people live with at least one parent. 52% of 18 to 29-year-olds have basically come back in to live with their parents. That's the highest percentage in modern history, even since before the 1930s Great Depression. Do you think that's the type of thing where when the economy gets rolling again and gets back to something resembling normal, when those millennials and Gen Zers want to move out, that can increase household formation again and increase some of the demand?
Those two might offset each other, right? So I think post-COVID, we may see some parents move back in or families move back together, which would reduce demand. But I also think, as you said, right, the folks that have an economic loss and had to move in with parents will then have that economic strength to go back out on their own. That may end up being a wash, but it could lean either way, and probably more likely to end, as you said, with increased demand.
Well, with this ongoing low supply that we have, is a foreclosure crisis going to come in the next year or two? Could that cause a housing market crash and a glut of supply? We're going to talk about that when we come back with Sean O'Toole of Property Radar. You're listening to Get Rich Education. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Hey, is your IRA in a real estate syndication? Yikes, a 37% UBIT tax could hit you, but you still have a chance to set up your EQRP and avoid this. Did you make too much money in 2020 and need more deductions? Now federal law lets you set up an EQRP in 2021 and get deductions for last year, retroactively. Even put old IRA and 401k money in Bitcoin, gold, or your own business. Get control of all of your retirement money, tax and penalty free. Text EQRP in all capital letters to 72,000. The people that our listeners can't stop talking about are Ridge Lending Group and MLS 42056. They provided you with more loans than anyone. It's where I got my last few loans, and they finance single-family income property up to fourplexes. They're the #1 lender for both beginners and veterans. Start your pre-qualification, chat with President Chaley Ridge personally, and you'll end up with your custom plan for expanding your cash flowing portfolio. Start at ridgelendinggroup.com.
This is the Millionaire Minds T. Harbeck. You're listening to the powerful Get Rich Education with Keith Weinhold. Don't quit your daydream.
You're listening to the show that's created more financial freedom for busy people just like you than nearly any show in the world. This is Get Rich Education. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. We're talking with Sean O'Toole of PropertyRadar.com about forecasting future trends in the real estate market. He's really on the cutting edge. He's really an expert on this stuff in giving you the data that you need and telling you the data that's less important to you so you can make better informed decisions as a real estate investor. Sean, forbearance is a word that's really been introduced into everyone's vocabulary since last year, that gives homeowners the ability to postpone payments. And that's especially important for those that might have lost their job due to the pandemic. And some people are concerned that, well, when this forbearance period ends and these homeowners postpone their payments all these months, are they going to have to catch up, or will they be able to catch up? And that really leads to the question, do you think a foreclosure crisis is coming in the next, say, year or two that can affect housing prices? Tell us what you think.
Let me just take one step back and talk about how the world changed in September 2009 from a regulatory standpoint. So kind of pre-September 2008, the regulatory framework was such that banks were required to clean up bad assets as fast as possible. And what that basically meant that is if you stopped making your payment, they would move you through the delinquency and foreclosure process as quickly as possible. So you go 30, 60, 90 days late, notice of default, notice of trustee sale, or the filing of a foreclosure suit, depending on whether you're a judicial or non-judicial state. They foreclose as quickly as possible. They put that property on the market immediately, no matter what the market conditions are, and they sell it for whatever price they can get. That was the regulatory framework. That was the rules that were imposed on banks pre-2008. I'm not saying the banks have no responsibility for the foreclosure crisis, but that was the regulatory framework that got us into that crisis. And what that led to was a very large number of properties going on the market at the same time. In Stockton, California, I'll keep coming back to that at one point.
Ground zero.
16 years of inventory based on the normal number of properties that sell each year. 16 years of inventory on the market in Stockton, California, right? There was just no way it could ever recover.
That's almost a generation's worth of inventory.
Yeah, it's just absolutely crazy, right? And then investors discovered that at those prices, that was a 10, 12, 15% return on investment. And that 16 years of inventory went to almost nothing in a few months' time because the prices just got pushed down so far. And that's what happens when you have that much more inventory. At the same time, keep in mind that lenders had removed loans from the market. So a regular person couldn't take advantage of those prices, right? So it took investors coming in and paying all cash to take advantage of that. So that's kind of this pre-foreclosure crisis regulatory framework. After this kind of happened, the regulators changed their position or mindset completely and said, wait a second, like it's our job as a regulator to keep homeowners in their homes no matter what. And so you had this really huge shift in mindset. And at the same time, the banks realized, well, geez, we're putting these things on the market at a 12 cap, a 12% return on investment, but we can go to institutional buyers like Colony Homes and Blackstone and others, Invitation Homes, and we can sell them at a 7% return on investment. That's almost twice the price. Why are we putting all these homes on the market at these ridiculously prices? We could rent them out and get a better return on investment. We should hold them versus selling them. So there's this huge mindset shift that happened in the last foreclosure crisis that will basically keep us from ever having another similar foreclosure crisis. We will not see a flood, a dumping of inventory on the market again. And so we won't see these huge price declines that we saw happen last time. The regulatory framework is no longer there to allow that happen. The banks kind of learned a lesson. We just won't see that same level of foreclosure crisis ever again. It's one of those things where each time they learn a lesson, after the 90s foreclosure crisis, the savings and loan crisis, right? And they let the savings and loans fail. You know, this time they said, okay, we're not going to do that. We're not going to create this federal home bank. So we're not going to do that again. We're going to go down this other path. And now they're going to learn again, and there'll be some new problem, but it won't be the same as last time. And I don't think we'll see the same price declines at all. Now, that's not to say that there aren't a lot of people in trouble, right? We've got about somewhere around 6% of mortgages that are delinquent, 5.5% or so that are in forbearance. Some of those forbearance agreements call for repayment, the forbearance amount at the end of the forbearance period, which of course nobody's going to really be able to do is suddenly come up with 6 months of payments. But, the Biden administration just came out and said, certainly for any of the federally backed mortgage companies and the FHA loans and the rest, they're going to work to come up with reasonable repayment plans. And I expect that to be the case across the board. Still a lot of people out there struggling. I have no doubt we'll see an increase in foreclosures once the moratoriums are lifted. We're already seeing some small bounce back now. I expect that to continue. You can't just stop foreclosures altogether. Otherwise, who'd make their payment, right? You have to have some fear in the market. Otherwise, nobody will pay. I think we'll see an increase in foreclosures for sure. I think we'll see some pressure on prices, but nothing like last time.
That is some great context with the regulatory environment that we've been in and how that creates a buffer against the housing price crash. When we talk about housing prices, we think of a lot of things. It's not just the price itself, but it's the inflation adjusted price versus previous eras. And then it's the realization that very few homeowners actually buy a home based on the price. They buy it based on the payment. We've got the historically low interest rates. There's another component too, and it has to do with wages and salaries, and that's affordability. Sean, when you roll all those things in together and maybe other things, price, inflation adjusted price, mortgage interest rates, affordability, what do you think of as properly valued versus overvalued in the real estate market when we talk about the future direction of prices here?
Big picture, I think properly valued is if everybody had to rebuy their house in a market right now. By that judge, right? Like what's affordable to the population of that area? Pretty much every market, or at least every popular market, is overvalued. What the new buyers coming in can afford, especially in any desirable market, is going to be more than what most of the people that are already in that market can afford. With only about 5% of homes selling a year, it's not that hard to find 5% of folks, especially in highly desirable areas, that are willing to pay more than people who live there today could possibly afford to pay. That means that most desirable areas are gentrifying to some degree, which is, I think, a bummer and it essentially means those areas are overvalued. But I think that's kind of the natural state of things. On the interest rate side, if we look at the total debt, right? So whether that's corporate debt, household debt, auto debt, certainly sovereign debt, the federal debt, state debt, we've really created so much debt that if interest rates go up significantly, it's a disaster, right? Because as interest rates go up, you need more income to repay those, which for federal and state debt means more taxes, kind of becomes a death spiral. In our artificial economy, very stimulated economy that we have today, I don't expect interest rates to rise much. They really can't without causing a pretty significant crisis. In 2016, I said when we have our next crisis, we'll see mortgage rates in the twos, which happened after COVID.
That's right. And not many people were believing you or believing that interest rates could get that low, but now they have.
These black swan events, whether it's COVID or 9/11 or the housing market crash of 2008 or whatever, these kind of black swan events that have economic impact, they do happen, right? We had an incredibly long run this last time from 2008 to 2020.
The longest run in American history of economic expansion year after year, yes.
Yeah. And so hopefully we get the next one is as long and we're not facing another thing like COVID for another decade or so. But at some point, one will happen. And I think when that happens, we'll see mortgage rates in the ones. I pull from Japan there as kind of my example. Japan now has 40-year mortgage rates in the mid ones. And it's just necessary as Japan has the highest debt to GDP ratio in the world. And lower interest rates kind of come as a part of that. And I think it's not only where the U.S. is headed, but it's where most of the world's headed, especially any part of the world with a strong central bank.
That is a remarkable premonition that we can see interest rates in the ones here in the near future. Of course, economies, when they're slow, they're incentivized to lower interest rates because that makes consumers not want to save, and instead it makes them more likely to want to go borrow with those low rates to do things like start a business or invest in real estate. And that sure will be an interesting intersection if we get inflationary pressure. How in the heck are they going to be able to keep interest rates low? Because conventionally, the tool for keeping the lid on inflation is raising interest rates to try to cool an overheating economy. Sean, you do a lot of work with future trends. You own a data company specifically that helps people that are in real estate make more informed choices. So tell us some more about that and how you specifically use data to help people find deals that they couldn't find otherwise.
Both with Foreclosure Radar, which was our original product, and now Property Radar, we mine public records data. So data from the county assessors, county recorders, and county courthouses, and county GIS departments. There's 3,142 county or county equivalent offices around the United States. And then there's those 4 different divisions. So there's over 12,000 data sources we pull from to really provide a detailed picture of each property and their owners in the United States. So we can use that for quite a few things. Obviously, for looking at market activity and trends, which we do, doing due diligence on an individual property and looking into its title history, how often the person refinanced, foreclosure history is, other things along those lines, the sales history of that property, using it to do comparables, look at other sales in the area, other listings in the area to see what the value of this property might be. The biggest one, and the service we primarily provide, is to help small businesses, real estate investors, realtors, mortgage brokers, home services companies that are trying to reach home or commercial property owners. We have over 200 criteria that they can use to kind of focus in on their ideal customer. So the wildfires here in California last year, if you're a roofer, in most counties, we know which roofs are wood shake. And so if you're a roofing company, like when the news is wildfires every day, reaching out to people who have wood shake roofs is a pretty good marketing ploy. 200 criteria like that, whether it's investors going after absentee owners or vacant homes, or folks in foreclosure, realtors looking for properties to list, et cetera, is what we do day to day.
Gosh, that's a great example of how you use the granular data that you have there to help investors make better decisions. Sean O'Toole, PropertyRadar.com. It's been fun to talk about the state of the housing market and what we might expect in the future. Thanks so much for coming on to the show.
Thank you.
Yeah, great expert insight from Sean O'Toole today. You can try out his platform free there at PropertyRadar.com. Sean's belief is that you are not going to have a glut of foreclosed homes that come onto the market and create any sort of price crash, although there could be some that come on the market that help bring some of this badly needed supply relief, but a glut won't happen again due to low supply and how the regulatory environment has changed from the prior recession and some other reasons, though there will be a few homeowners that get into trouble when the foreclosure moratoria expire. And what do they say? How do you know when you're in a recession or a depression? What's one difference? Well, a recession is when your neighbor loses their home, and a depression is when you lose your home. That is one difference there. We don't expect nearly as many people to lose their homes as during the global financial crisis. Back then, more people lost their homes, and that was on top of already too high supply plus careless lending standards. And today, we've got that chronically low supply, pretty responsible lending. And part of the reason that so many people are going to be able to get caught up on their housing payments is that with forbearance, often they are simply able to postpone making payments and just tack, say, 9 months of missed payments onto the end of their loan. That's what's expected. So instead of having a 30-year mortgage, then they essentially have a 30-year and 9-month mortgage. Well, that's actually a good deal for the homeowner. My goodness, I'd take that deal. Now, you don't really want to take that deal because if you declare forbearance and you don't need it, well, then that might affect your ability to buy more income property at these historically low interest rates. Speaking of which, Sean was one of the earliest prognosticators expecting mortgage rates to fall down into the twos. That did indeed happen. And now he predicts that they will fall into the ones, like less than two. Where have all the houses gone? What low inventory like this means is that there will continue to be multiple offers on a property that's for sale. Well, multiple offers, that's exactly what drives up the price of the home. Now, no one ever truly knows the future, but last year, I know of just 3 people, though most didn't say this, but I know of just 3 people that said that there will be a housing price crash this year. Well, today, one of those 3 now says that prices won't fall until 2022, and the other 2, they just don't even talk about a housing price crash anymore at all. Big thanks to the founder and CEO of Property Radar, Sean O'Toole, today. Next week, Ken McElroy returns to the show with me yet again. We're going to talk about how you get together the money for real estate investing, including some ways that you probably never thought about before. Until then, I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Don't quit your daydream.
Nothing on this show should be considered specific, personal, or professional advice. Please consult an appropriate tax, legal, real estate, financial, or business professional for individualized advice. Opinions of guests are their own. Information is not guaranteed. All investment strategies have the potential for profit or loss. The host is operating on behalf of Get Rich Education, LLC exclusively.
The preceding program was brought to you by your home for wealth building, GetRichEducation.com.